Way back in 2008, Sonic Unleashed was released for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 to middling reception. However, over the years, many fans have gone back and found an experience that they really enjoy. For most, this is due to the game's day stages, where the player controls Sonic himself and boosts through these dense levels as fast as possible. However, there wasn't just one version of Unleashed. No, a separate game released for the Wii and PlayStation 2, containing its own set of day stages entirely separate from the other version. Unfortunately, its reception over the years, well, it seems like people just haven't gone back to it much. Whenever people mention Unleashed, they are almost certainly talking about this game, not this one. In fact, to most, Unleashed HD is seen as the default version of the game, or even the real version. But still, the daytime stages we have in this version of Unleashed are unique 3D Sonic levels and deserve to be discussed alongside the other Boost games as equally important. Which is exactly why I'm beginning my series discussing the 3D Boost gameplay and level design here with this underappreciated game. That's right, no story discussion, no taking time for alternate styles of gameplay, just talking about how 3D Boost Sonic himself was handled across all the games he's appeared in, starting here. Let's do it. The first stage of this game gives us a great insight into how these stages will be handled. See, the player begins by running down this straight path, directing Sonic into boosters and eventually drifting around a corner. Following that, there's a ramp the player can use to go into these red rings, which propel them forward. So far, all of this is simply meant to get the player comfortable with the game's controls, as well as how the boost system functions. Because, unlike all the other 3D Boost games, this game's boost button isn't something that the player holds down to keep their speed indefinitely so long as the meter has more charge left. Instead, as the player collects more rings, drifts, and crashes into enemies, individual segments of this meter will fill up, and one of them can be used by pressing the boost button, which will temporarily transition Sonic to a faster state. Additionally, as the player collects more rings within a stage, they will level up and gain more boosts. Normally, I might have an issue with how straightforward this level is toward the start, even if it's something of a tutorial or an introduction. However, in this case, I think it makes sense, because here the game is trying to teach the player that boosts need to be used during these types of moments. What I mean is that in this game, boost is largely meant to be used when the player can see a clear path in front of them. This way, these openings become something more than empty space. Instead, they're an opportunity to go faster and use boosts well by chaining them into dash pads and refilling the meter by colliding into enemies and boosting into rings. This light strategic element is a big part of this game's unique take on the boost formula, and this is a reasonable way of introducing that to the player. Following this, a choice is presented to the player in the form of an upper and lower path. As you might expect, the upper one requires additional input to reach, and demands the player uses the drift mechanic correctly if they want to stay up there. The reward for this? Well, it's faster than the bottom path, which forces the player to slow down as they climb up these steps. Of course, this style of design is incredibly common for Sonic games, and a big part of what makes them special to many fans, including myself. The joy of finding, learning, and mastering the faster path can become exhilarating, and at many points, this game absolutely nails that. Let's just look at my favorite stage, Rooftop Run. The HD version tends to get all the love, and it's well deserved, but man, this one's great too. The player begins by running down a pretty straightforward path, but a choice quickly presents itself. Take the right path, which requires a sharp turn, or take the long way around. Now, on my first playthrough, I only caught these rings out of the corner of my eye, and decided to wait for my next run to check where they'd go. And that right there is one way this game consistently gets this multiple path style design right. It's super easy to tell which path will be faster based on how the designers laid out the rings, and they place them in a manner where, if the player's paying attention, they'll likely notice them and be able to test them out on subsequent attempts. This way, the player's rewarded by discovering things and memorizing the layout and pulling off trickier maneuvers, like a sharp drift. Right up ahead, actually, the stage has a moment just like that, where turning to the left will bypass this segment, but this actually illustrates another type of path in this game. Because let's say I didn't notice this gap. After all, it doesn't have any rings denoting its location like the last one did. Well, then later I'll probably notice this, a collection of rings extending outward from a different place. Now that I've seen this, I know there was another path somewhere earlier in the level that I just missed. Unlike the previous path, this one now relies on a bit more exploration, as well as memorization and reflexes, because I need to go back to previous sections of the level that this path could have extended from. Again, this is something the game does at many points, and it does a wonderful job of cluing the player in without giving away too much of the stage's design at a glance. Basically, it leaves ample room for discovery without becoming too obtuse or chaotic. Anyway, back to Rooftop Run. From here, this stage continues to be an absolute banger due to the sheer density of paths and the variety of playstyles. There are these open sections and turns to drift around, enemies to homing attack onto for a faster route, sidestepping sections in tight corridors, more branching paths that are only accessible with proper use of Sonic's abilities, zip lines and boost paths, and running along the wall and branching 2D paths to spice things up, and grind rails and a sidestepping section with laser robots. With proper play, Sonic flies through all of this with an electric pace, leading to a stage that constantly has something new and exciting to experience. Another one of my favorite stages, Dragon Road, does something even better. In particular, there's this opening section where the level branches in 3 paths. To the right, there's the slowest but simplest one, which the player will remain on with minimal input. To the middle, a slightly faster path that requires more platforming, dodging, and use of the homing attack. And finally, the left path, which is the fastest but most dangerous, with the player boosting over water that can drown them if they slow down or hit an obstacle. This section is special for multiple reasons, the first of which is speed. Of course, it's simply satisfying to pull off the fastest path and get one step closer to that S rank. But that much is obvious. The real thing that makes this section special is how it manages to communicate which way is fastest through intuitive level design. After all, by now, the player will have probably made the connection that the most difficult path to reach is generally the fastest one. So the one that requires the least input, well, that's probably the slowest. Then the one that requires they stick to the top path earlier and homing attack off enemies, makes sense that would be a bit faster. Meanwhile, the fastest path requires the player to wait a moment or make a relatively risky jump. Maneuvers that can either force them down to a slower path or result in Sonic drowning. This way, the game manages to clearly communicate risk and reward to the player simply using its enemy placement and general layout, without ever needing to outright tell them that this way is faster and this way is slower. It's the type of intuitive communication with a player that can end up feeling almost magical when it all clicks into place, and it leads to stages that are impressively readable and easy to digest and comprehend, without them feeling oversimplified or hand-holdy. Finally, and this is what I love the most, each of these paths contain meaningful gameplay. It's not simply that the fastest path sets you on some flashy animation, or that the slower path forces you down a longer corridor with nothing to do. Nah, each of them has their own enemies and obstacles to dodge, their own hazards to contend with, so it's not enough to just get to one of these paths. Once there, the player still needs to put their skill to the test during any of these sections, regardless of if it's fastest or slowest. This way, the player isn't able to go on autopilot and allow the game to play itself. No matter what, there will be input, and that input consistently matters. However, you might have noticed something from all the footage I've been showing. There isn't very much actual platforming happening. You know, the thing that cements Sonic games in their usual genre. And yeah, that's because there isn't. See, where the other 3D boost games tend to go 2D for platforming sections, this one doesn't do that very much. Like, of all my footage, shockingly little of it is actual platforming. On one hand, I can completely understand this decision. This sort of high-speed gameplay doesn't necessarily mix well with traditional platforming, which almost requires that the player slows down to succeed. After granting the player this speed, that could feel like a major roadblock or an obnoxious detour. Plus, the game finds other ways to instill challenge, like these increasingly sharp turns across levels and obstacles Sonic can run into without enough precise movement. Or sometimes you gotta try to quickly course correct to a nearby boost pad for maximum speed. My main point is just that there is stuff to do here, and there is challenge. On the other hand though, the stages can sometimes become a bit one note and bland. Easily the worst example of this is Arid Sands, my least favorite stage in the game. See, where Dragon Road provides meaningful gameplay across its various paths, this one simply doesn't. My first time through this stage, I purposely stuck on the slower, more straightforward path the whole way, just to see how it was laid out and get a full picture. But then I realized something. Nothing was happening. All I had to do was run forward and I was golden. There was an impressive lack of enemies or obstacles to dodge, and the rare thing that was there didn't really pose much of a threat to my speed. Now, don't get me wrong, this was still the slower path, and I was bypassing and ignoring plenty of alternate areas. But for an unskilled player or someone who simply doesn't want to go for the ideal route, there's very little here to keep them interested. Little in the way of challenge or really level design to speak of. But it isn't as though the stage has no depth. In fact, when I purposely went for a faster time, it felt like an entirely different beast, and required plenty of player input. However, I believe input should be required regardless of which path the player is on. What I mean is that the slower path shouldn't purely be a longer straightaway. It should have more obstacles to dodge, or enemies to home onto, or rising platforms to leap across. Just something. And this is where the game certainly could have used more in the way of traditional platforming. In fact, there are a number of moments like this, though none are nearly as egregious as Arid Sands. Often, these stages are more like racetracks than platforming levels, which isn't necessarily a problem. In fact, some of them would probably be pretty fun racetracks, but without other racers to compete against and to add an unpredictable element, well, then we're left with something flat and uninspired sometimes. Actually, I think a competitive racing mode with slightly modified stages and items could have done wonders for some of these stages. Like, look at the opening section of Eggman Land. Come on, that's a racetrack. But alas, there's no racing mode, so this doesn't mean that much, even if it is a pretty cool idea. However, the fact remains that if the player wants to improve their times, if they want to engage with these levels, they will need to learn the ins and outs of the stages, overcome challenges, and master Sonic's controls. And when I've finally figured out a stage and I've got a great run going, man, it feels fantastic. Just writing this script, I want to go back and do another run of Jungle Joyride to tighten my turns or try a new path. I want to get to that section of Cool Edge that I kept missing because I didn't react fast enough. I want to get that S rank on Dragon Road, and I certainly want to experience the frenetic action and variety of Rooftop Run again. All of this is to say that overall, the strategic boost, various paths, and readable but dense stages more than make up for its weak points. These day levels are certainly worth a shake, and deserve to be part of the conversation surrounding this boost style of design. Next time though, we'll be discussing the stages most people think of when they hear these things, the Unleashed HD versions. So if you enjoyed this video, I encourage you to subscribe to be notified about when the next video in this series comes out, and I'm also doing other videos every single day this month. Either way, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day. Bye bye for now.